As I stared at the deep crimson stains dripping down the pristine white fabric of my custom wedding gown, a chilling realization washed over me, a wave of clarity that frozen the very blood in my veins. This woman had hated me for the longest time, hiding her malice behind a mask of sugary smiles and sweet-toned words. Every compliment she had ever given me was nothing more than a disguised insult, a subtle jab meant to chip away at my worth while keeping her own hands seemingly clean. How was I supposed to know that she would go this far on the most important day of my life, just to ensure my wedding would never take place? How was I supposed to know that the very woman who had birthed, raised, and baited the man I would gladly die for harbored a hatred so dark, so consuming, that she would seek to destroy my happiness completely? I had spent years believing we could find common ground, but all along, she wasn't just adjusting to me. She was actively competing with me. She was competing with the sheer depth of love her son had for me. He loved his mother and he loved me, two entirely different kinds of love that should have coexisted in harmony. So why couldn't she just accept that and let us be? Why did the happiest day of my life have to turn into an absolute nightmare, a night's meal for her insatiable bitterness? If you find this hard to believe, if you think a mother could never be capable of such calculated malice against her own child's future, then please, listen closely to this story. Tanya Jackson stood before the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of her luxury bridal suite, watching the golden rays of the early morning Florida sunlight spill across the meticulously manicured estate grounds below. From this height, the sprawling gardens, the elegant stone pathways, and the grand white pavilions looked like something torn straight from the pages of a fairy tale. In just a few short hours, this very estate would serve as the backdrop for her wedding. Her heart overflowed with a chaotic mixture of intense excitement, nervous anticipation, and a deep, cautious hope. She clutched her silk robe tightly around her shoulders, trying to quiet the anxious whispers in her mind, and convince herself that the long, grueling journey which had brought her to this exact moment was finally coming to a beautiful end. For 4 long years, Tanya had loved Lennox Jabari with a devotion that had survived every challenge placed before them. They had weathered professional setbacks, personal grief, financial stresses, and the intense, suffocating pressure of an overbearing family dynamic. Lennox was a man of profound integrity, successful, deeply compassionate, and fiercely loyal, coming from an affluent family where reputation and tradition meant everything. Tanya, who had built her career from the ground up through sheer grit and determination, came from a modest, hard-working background where love was spoken plainly and without conditions. This stark contrast in their social upbringing had always created an invisible barrier, an underlying tension that Tanya had spent years silently enduring, particularly during the countless uncomfortable family gatherings where she found herself facing the one person who had never truly welcomed her into their lives, Diane, Lennox's mother. Diane Jabari was a woman of immense elegance, high social standing, and terrifyingly subtle malice. She was the matriarch of a wealthy, tight-knit social circle, a woman who had mastered the art of psychological warfare under the guise of high society etiquette. To the outside world, Diane was a doting, gracious mother, but to Tanya, she was a living nightmare who had perfected the art of making someone feel utterly worthless, while leaving absolutely no evidence behind. Diane had never openly attacked Tanya. She had never raised her voice, used a harsh profanity, or thrown a public tantrum. Instead, she chose to weaponize her smiles. She would smile warmly at Tanya, her eyes crinkling with apparent fondness, while delivering words that felt like a slow-acting poison. During the early months of her relationship with Lennox, Tanya had desperately tried to believe that Diane's coldness was simply a mother's natural caution. She told herself that perhaps Diane just needed time to adjust to the idea of her only son building an independent life with someone new, and that eventually she would come to see that Tanya genuinely loved Lennox for exactly who he was, not for his family's wealth or status. Unfortunately, as the months bled into years, time did not heal the wound. It only made the situation infinitely worse. Every single family dinner at the Jabari mansion became a grueling exercise in emotional patience for Tanya. Every holiday gathering felt like a twisted, invisible test designed for her to fail, leaving her feeling utterly exhausted, diminished, and isolated by the end of the night. Diane's method of torture was brilliant in its cruelty. She would casually bring up Lennox's wealthy former girlfriends in the middle of dinner, spending agonizing minutes praising how beautifully those young women fit into high society, and how much the family missed their presence. Then, she would turn her chillingly bright smile toward Tanya and offer a compliment that felt like a dagger disguised as a bouquet. She would say things like, "You are so much more confident than I expected, Tanya dear." Or, "I suppose Lennox always did enjoy surprises, no matter how unconventional." Whenever Tanya tried to explain these deeply unsettling interactions to her friends or even to Lennox, she struggled immensely, because the comment sounded completely harmless when repeated aloud. That was Diane's greatest strength. She understood exactly how far she could push the boundaries of psychological cruelty without ever appearing malicious to an outside observer. And whenever Lennox would gently question his mother about her tone, Diane would instantly transform into the deeply wounded, fragile mother whose innocent words had been unfairly misunderstood by an overly sensitive outsider. The first major fracture in this fragile peace had erupted less than a year into the relationship. During a festive family barbecue that Lennox had organized, genuinely believing it would be a perfect opportunity for everyone to grow closer. Instead of the warm blending of families he had envisioned, Diane spent the entire afternoon systematically introducing Tanya to wealthy relatives and prominent family friends as Lennox's little friend. Not his girlfriend, not his partner, but a casual friend, as if Tanya were a temporary fixture, an insignificant passing phase in her son's life. By the time Diane reached the fourth introduction, the air had grown incredibly thick with tension, and several extended family members were exchanging awkward, uncomfortable glances, while Tanya forced herself to keep a rigid, painful smile plastered across her face to avoid causing a scene. Later that evening, a deeply frustrated Lennox confronted his mother in private about the blatant disrespect. True to her nature, Diane immediately burst into a flood of dramatic tears, clutching her chest and claiming she had simply misspoken due to exhaustion. She insisted that everyone was ganging up on her and attacking her unfairly in her own home. By the end of the overblown performance, Lennox found himself comforting and apologizing to his weeping mother, while Tanya sat in the next room, completely isolated, silently wondering how an act of blatant disrespect against her had somehow been twisted into her fault. Over the next few years, Tanya learned the hard way that Diane possessed an extraordinary, sociopathic ability to completely rewrite reality to suit her narrative. If she explicitly excluded Tanya from important family vacation plans, she claimed it was a tragic administrative accident. If she made a deeply hurtful comment about Tanya's modest career or clothing choices, she claimed it was born out of pure maternal concern for her son's future standing. If anyone dared to directly challenge her toxic behavior, Diane would seamlessly portray herself as the ultimate victim of an ungrateful generation. The agonizing pattern repeated itself so frequently that Tanya eventually stopped expecting any real change from the matriarch. Instead, she chose to completely sever her emotional attachment to Diane's approval and focus entirely on the one thing that truly mattered: Lennox. Because despite his mother's insidious manipulation, Lennox never stopped showing Tanya a fierce, unwavering love. He listened intently whenever she expressed her deepest frustrations. He actively defended her when his mother's barbs became too visible, and although he occasionally struggled to recognize the full, invisible extent of Diane's masterfully disguised sabotage, Tanya knew his heart was entirely in the right place. That profound knowledge was the anchor that carried her through the darkest, most agonizing moments of rejection. It was what had convinced her to say a resounding yes when he dropped to one knee and proposed, and it was what allowed her to finally imagine a future where Diane's toxic opinions would no longer hold any power over their collective happiness. Now, that beautiful, hard-won future was finally within their reach. The grand wedding had been meticulously planned for nearly 14 grueling months, with every single detail carefully chosen by Tanya and Lennox to reflect the beautiful, balanced life they hoped to build together. The lush floral arrangements, the classical music, the precise seating charts, the elegant menu, and the breathtaking estate venue, everything was a testament to their love and unity. Yet even during this sacred planning process, Diane had consistently found ways to inject venom into their joy. She questioned nearly every creative decision Tanya made, complained bitterly about the guest lists, criticized the elegant decorations as being too plain, and repeatedly attempted to force expensive changes that absolutely nobody had requested. The largest and most toxic disagreement had involved the exclusive overnight accommodations at the estate. The high-end venue offered a very limited number of ultra-luxury suites, and Tanya and Lennox had mutually decided that these select rooms would be strictly reserved for the bridal party and Tanya's aging parents, who were traveling a massive distance from out of state. Diane lived a mere 35 minutes away from the estate and had no practical, logical need for an overnight room. When Lennox gently explained this logical decision to his mother, Diane had smiled sweetly, nodded, and claimed she completely understood. For several weeks following that conversation, she appeared unusually calm, almost detached, which gave Tanya a fleeting sense of relief. But the peace was an illusion. Tanya soon discovered through a sympathetic cousin that Diane had been quietly systematically calling every relative in their lineage, weeping softly and telling them that she was being maliciously excluded and discarded from her own son's wedding. According to the toxic narrative Diane was spinning, the room situation was definitive, public proof that Tanya was intentionally trying to humiliate her and alienate her from Lennox. When Lennox learned of this smear campaign, his usual patience snapped completely. He confronted his mother directly, his voice firm and unyielding, informing her that her manipulation would not work and that the decision was absolutely final. After that intense confrontation, Diane became strangely, completely quiet. It was an unnatural, heavy silence that deeply unsettled Tanya's instincts, acting as a dark cloud looming over the upcoming festivities. Yet, as the morning of the wedding day finally dawned, Tanya desperately wanted to believe that the worst of the storm was behind them. She craved peace, she craved unadulterated happiness, and she wanted just one single day free from the suffocating grip of tension and emotional conflict, standing inside the lavish bridal suite that morning. Surrounded by the joyful chatter of her bridesmaids, the gentle guidance of her mother, and the overwhelming electric excitement filling the room, Tanya finally allowed herself to drop her guard. She imagined that perhaps Diane had finally accepted the unyielding reality of the situation. Perhaps the matriarch had realized that this wedding was going to happen beautifully regardless of her bitter opinions, and perhaps she had finally chosen to support her son's joy over her own toxic resentment. As pure, genuine laughter echoed throughout the suite and the professional makeup artists continued their precise work, Tanya's eyes drifted toward the elegant, heavy garment bag hanging securely near the cedar closet door. Inside that bag rested the custom-designed wedding gown she had spent months dreaming about, a masterpiece of delicate embroidery and flowing silk. The dress represented far more than mere fabric. It was a physical manifestation of every sacrifice she had made, every hour she had tirelessly worked, and every bright hope she carried for her future with Lennox. In just a few short hours, she would zip herself into that pristine white gown and walk down the aisle toward the man she loved more than life itself. A soft, radiant smile graced her lips at the beautiful thought. What Tanya did not know, what she could never have possibly anticipated in her worst nightmares, was that while she stood there imagining the happiest day of her life, a dark force was pulling up to the estate with a radically different plan, a single, malicious decision fueled by years of unchecked bitterness that was about to shatter everything Tanya had worked so hard to build, leaving the entire wedding hanging by a thread as a shadow loomed just outside the door. By the time the clock struck 9:15, the atmosphere inside the bridal suite had reached a peak of joyous energy, a vibrant bubble of love and celebration that seemed completely impenetrable to the outside world. Pop music played softly from a Bluetooth speaker, mixing with the rhythmic clinking of mimosa glasses, the hiss of hairspray, and the bright, unbridled laughter of Tanya's closest friends. Her bridesmaids, dressed in matching satin robes, fluttered around the room like a flock of colorful butterflies, adjusting their own makeup, capturing candid photos, and making sure Tanya didn't have to lift a single finger. Tanya's mother sat gracefully in an armchair by the vanity, a soft tissue perpetually clutched in her hand, tears of pure pride welling up in her eyes every single time she looked at her daughter. Tanya felt a profound sense of peace wash over her as the makeup artist applied the final delicate touches to her radiant face. For the first time in over a year, the crushing weight of wedding planning, the endless logistical nightmares, the financial strains of commissioning her dream dress, and the constant suffocating fear of Diane's disapproval completely melted away. She was safe. She was surrounded by people who genuinely cherished her. In less than 3 hours, she would be standing at the altar, looking into the eyes of Lennox, pledging her life to the man who had fought through his own mother's emotional blockades just to hold her hand. She glanced over at the large, opaque garment bag, hanging securely from the valet hook on the closet door, her heart swelling with an almost overwhelming sense of anticipation. That dress was her armor, her crown, the physical manifestation of her triumph over every single voice that had ever whispered, "She wasn't good enough for the Jabari family," but the universe has a cruel way of shattering a beautiful illusion just when you feel the most secure. At exactly 5 minutes to 9, a sharp, distinct knock echoed through the suite, cutting through the music and laughter like a sudden crack of thunder. At first, no one thought anything of it. The morning had been a revolving door of delivery drivers, florists bringing in fresh bouquets, and photographers scouting the natural light. One of the bridesmaids, humming a cheerful tune, skipped over to the heavy oak door and swung it open without a single care in the world. The moment the heavy door parted, the joyful noise in the room died a sudden, violent death. The laughter evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, suffocating silence that made the air feel heavy and unbreathable. Standing in the doorway, framed by the bright corridor, was Diane Jabari. She was already fully dressed for the ceremony, sporting an impeccably tailored, cream-colored designer dress that bordered dangerously close to off-white, adorned with diamonds that caught the hallway light with a cold, piercing glare. A perfectly painted, radiant smile rested on her lips, but her eyes, cold, calculating, and predatory, swept over the room with a terrifying precision, taking in every detail of Tanya's joy. In her left hand, she held an expensive, sweat-baited bottle of champagne, and delicately pinched between the fingers of her right hand were two crystal flutes. The visual was an immediate, jarring assault to Tanya's senses. Diane had not been invited to this sacred space. She had explicitly been left off the bridal suite access list to protect Tanya's mental peace. Yet here she was, standing on the threshold like a ghost invading a feast. "Good morning, my beautiful family," Diane purred, her voice dripping with a synthetic, calculated warmth as she stepped into the suite without waiting for an invitation, her high heels clicking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The bridesmaids exchanged quick, deeply alarmed glances, their bodies instinctively tensing up as they looked to Tanya for guidance. But no one moved to stop her. No one wanted to be the one to initiate a screaming match or create an ugly public scene on a morning that was supposed to be flawless, least of all Tanya herself. Diane glided across the room with a chilling, queen-like grace, bypassing the bridesmaids entirely, and approached the vanity where Tanya sat frozen in her chair. With a sudden, terrifying show of affection, Diane reached down and gently squeezed Tanya's bare shoulder, her fingers pressing just a little too firmly into the flesh. "Oh, Tanya, sweetheart, you look absolutely breathtaking already. Truly a vision," Diane whispered, her breath smelling faintly of mint and expensive perfume. "Thank you, Diane," Tanya replied, her voice cautious, tight, and completely guarded, her internal alarm bells screaming at a deafening volume. Diane's smile widened, revealing a row of perfect white teeth that felt less like a greeting and more like a warning. "I know things have been terribly strained between us, dear, and my heart has been so heavy," Diane said, looking around the room as if addressing an audience. "I was truly hoping we could share a small, entirely private moment of peace, just the two of us, to put the past behind us before you walk down that aisle to my only son." The room grew so intensely quiet that you could hear the distant chirping of birds outside the glass windows. Every single woman in that suite knew the grueling history of emotional warfare Diane had inflicted upon Tanya. They had stayed up late with Tanya, holding her while she cried after being systematically humiliated at family dinners. The sudden request felt deeply strange, entirely unexpected, and dripping with malicious suspicion, but Tanya was simply too emotionally exhausted to fight another battle on her wedding day. She was tired of always being the one forced to build defensive walls, tired of the grueling psychological labor of maintaining a fragile peace, and deeply tired of watching Lennox tear himself apart trying to mediate between his mother and his future wife. Against every single survival instinct screaming inside her gut, Tanya looked into Diane's eyes and forced herself to nod, whispering a quiet, "Okay." Diane's eyes flashed with a sudden, triumphant spark as she immediately began pouring the champagne into the crystal flutes, her movements smooth and practiced. She raised her glass high, offering a sweeping, poetic toast to Tanya's future, loudly praising the stunning floral arrangements, the grandeur of the venue, and the flawless execution of the wedding plans. For nearly 10 agonizing minutes, Diane performed the role of the ultimate, deeply supportive future mother-in-law, with an acting proficiency that would rival a Hollywood star. and Tanya, desperately craving an olive branch, almost allowed herself to believe that the transformation was completely genuine. Then, with a terrifying smoothness, Diane's predatory gaze shifted away from Tanya and locked onto the cedar closet door, specifically anchoring onto the large, black garment bag. "May I finally see the masterpiece, dear? I've heard so much about it," Diane asked softly, her voice dipping into a sweet, coaxing tone. Tanya hesitated, a sudden wave of nausea hitting her stomach as her deepest instincts begged her to say no. But after the elaborate show of peace Diane had just performed, refusing such a simple maternal request would make Tanya look completely unreasonable and hostile in front of her own bridal party. Stepping out of her chair, Tanya walked over to the closet, her hands trembling slightly as she grabbed the metal zipper. Slowly, carefully, she pulled the zipper down, parting the fabric to reveal the custom-designed wedding gown in all its pristine, breathtaking glory. A collective, breathless gasp echoed through the room. The dress was an absolute masterpiece of ivory silk, intricate, hand-stitched silver embroidery, and a flowing, ethereal train that seemed to capture the very essence of a fairy tale romance. It was flawless. It was a visual representation of Tanya's purity, her hard work, and her future. Diane stood completely frozen, her eyes locking onto the gown with a sudden, intense fury that she scrambled to conceal behind her mask. For a split second, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated envy, a toxic rage that she quickly smoothed over as she reached blindly toward a nearby vanity table. Her fingers didn't grasp the champagne glass she had been holding. Instead, her hand closed around a large, heavy tumbler filled to the brim with dark, staining red wine that one of the bridesmaids had left behind earlier that morning. Time seemed to grind to a horrific, agonizing crawl as Diane lifted the heavy glass of red wine. She didn't stumble, she didn't trip over her high heels, and she didn't lose her balance. With a chilling, deliberate calmness, she looked directly into Tanya's eyes, tilted her wrist forward, and poured the thick, dark crimson liquid in a steady, unbroken stream directly onto the front bodice of the white wedding gown. The heavy red wine cascaded down the delicate ivory fabric like an open, bleeding wound, instantly soaking through the layers of expensive silk, dissolving the intricate silver embroidery, and spreading out in a massive, irreversible web of deep purple destruction. For one long, agonizing, horrifying second, absolute paralysis gripped the entire room. No one moved, no one breathed. The shock was so profound, so violently unexpected, that the human brain refused to process the visual reality of what had just occurred. Then, the room collectively gasped, a jagged, terrified intake of air from 6 women who felt the world shatter around them. Tanya stared at the deep red liquid dripping off the hem of her ruined dress, her mind completely blank, her heart dropping into a bottomless abyss of despair. But the most monstrous part of the entire scene wasn't the ruined fabric. It was the expression on Diane's face when she finally looked up. There was absolutely no panic in her eyes, no genuine horror, no frantic searching for a towel. Instead, she put on a sickening, perfectly calculated performance of a clumsy old woman, bringing a hand to her mouth in a theatrical display of shock. "Oh, sweetheart, oh my goodness, I am so incredibly sorry. My hand just slipped. It was an absolute accident," Diane gasped, her voice completely hollow. In that exact terrifying second, Tanya looked directly past the fake gasp and straight into Diane's cold, triumphant eyes, and she finally knew the absolute truth with undeniable clarity. This was never an accident. This was an act of war, a calculated, merciless execution designed to destroy her spirit and ensure the wedding would never take place, leaving Tanya trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up. The suffocating silence that followed Diane's calculated act of destruction was suddenly broken by a frantic, chaotic burst of panic inside the bridal suite. One of the bridesmaids shrieked in horror, running blindly toward the bathroom to grab a handful of white towels, while Tanya's mother sat down heavily on the edge of a nearby sofa, covering her mouth as deep, agonizing tears spilled over her cheeks. Voices clashed and amplified in the tight space. Sustenance were shouted, questions were hurled into the air, and absolute panic gripped everyone present. Someone tried to blot the fabric, but the dark red liquid had already soaked deeply into the very core of the delicate silk fibers, spreading its irreversible stain wider and wider like an unstoppable poison. Yet, amidst the rising tide of hysteria, Tanya felt a strange, terrifying calm wash over her. It was a numbness so complete, so total, that it silenced the ringing in her ears. She ignored the frantic movements around her, ignored the useless towels, and kept her eyes locked entirely on Diane, who was already backing toward the exit with her hands raised in a masterfully executed display of faux innocence. Without a single tear, without screaming, and without losing her composure, Tanya pointed a steady, trembling finger at the door and uttered a single devastating directive: leave. When Diane opened her mouth to launch into another rehearsed, overly dramatic apology, Tanya stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like a razor blade. Leave now. Diane didn't just leave the suite. She glided down the grand hallway of the estate with the subtle, triumphant smirk of a villain who believed she had just won the entire war. To her, a wedding dress was the ultimate symbol of the day. By physically destroying it, she believed she had successfully destroyed Tanya's spirit and guaranteed that the ceremony would have to be canceled out of pure humiliation. Slipping unnoticed through the side corridors, Diane walked out into the manicured estate gardens, blending effortlessly back into the arriving crowd of early guests and high society relatives. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a catering tray, smoothed down the fabric of her cream-colored dress, and began chatting with an aunt looking entirely untouched by the trauma she had just inflicted. Her face showed no remorse, no anxiety, no fear of consequences. She was fully convinced that, just like every other time over the last 4 years, her wealth, her maternal status, and her masterfully crafted excuses would shield her from any real blame. She was ready to play the victim once again, waiting eagerly for the moment the cancellation would be announced, so she could comfort her son and gently guide him back under her total control. But inside the bridal suite, Tanya was already executing a plan that Diane had never anticipated. With fingers that shook from a volatile mix of grief and adrenaline, Tanya picked up her phone and dialed the one person whose heart was entirely hers: Lennox. The moment he answered, his cheerful, morning voice was instantly crushed by the sheer weight of what Tanya began to describe. She didn't leave out a single detail. She described the sweet, manipulative words Diane had used to gain entry, the chilling calmness with which she had reached for the red wine, and the deliberate, slow-motion tilt of her wrist that had ruined the custom gown. As Tanya spoke, a long, heavy, and dangerous silence stretched across the line from Lennox's end. It wasn't a silence of disbelief. It was the terrifying quiet of a man whose eyes had just been violently forced open to a truth he had spent years trying to rationalize away. The illusion of the well-meaning but difficult mother completely disintegrated in his mind. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry anger. It carried a freezing, absolute certainty that caused a shiver to run down Tanya's spine. "I'll be there in 4 minutes," he said, and the line went dead. The tension across the entire estate began to build to an unbearable pressure point as Lennox crossed the grounds with an unyielding, aggressive stride that startled the wedding coordinators and caterers who crossed his path. His mind was a roaring firestorm, replaying every single red flag, every passive-aggressive comment, and every tearful apology his mother had ever weaponized over the past 4 years. He realized with brutal clarity that by defending his mother in the past, he had inadvertently allowed her to believe she could get away with anything, even destroying the happiness of the woman he loved on their very wedding day. As he approached the garden pavilion, he spotted Diane standing elegantly among the floral arrangements, laughing softly with a group of wealthy family friends, completely unbothered by the psychological trauma she had left behind in the bridal suite. The sheer injustice of the sight solidified something permanent inside his chest. The villain was celebrating her victory, entirely unaware that the decades of absolute control she had held over her son were about to be shattered into a million unfixable pieces, and that the truth was marching directly toward her with a force she could never hope to manipulate. The atmosphere in the sun-drenched estate garden suddenly froze as Lennox stormed into the pavilion, his eyes locked onto his mother with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. Diane, who had been holding court among the affluent family members, noticed his approach and immediately flashed her familiar, practiced smile. "There you are, my boy," she said cheerfully, stepping forward as if to straighten his lapel. "We should probably discuss seating arrangements for—" But Lennox cut her off completely before she could finish the sentence, his voice echoing with a chilling, lethal quietness. "What happened in the bridal suite?" The smile instantly vanished from Diane's face for a fraction of a second, a tiny damning crack in her flawless performance, before she quickly scrambled to recover her mask of exaggerated regret. "Oh, Lennox, it was awful, absolutely terrible," she gasped. instantly clutching her chest as her eyes welled with theatrical tears. It was a tragic accident. My high heel caught on the rug, my hand slipped. I feel utterly sick about it. But for the first time in his entire life, Lennox was no longer listening like a son desperate to protect his mother's fragile image. He was listening like a man fiercely protecting his future wife, and the tired, rehearsed excuse fell completely flat. You poured wine on her dress, Mother. You stood there and you poured it, Lennox said, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Deanne's eyes widened dramatically, her face flushing a deep, guilty crimson as she realized her usual manipulation wasn't working. Lennox, how can you accuse me of such a thing? I am your mother, she cried out, her voice rising in pitch to attract the attention of the surrounding guests, attempting to turn herself into the victim yet again. But Lennox stepped closer, cutting off her exit, his voice vibrating with years of buried frustration that finally erupted into pure, unshakable certainty. For 4 years, you have spent every single day making Tanya feel unwelcome. You have criticized her, excluded her, undermined her, and every single time someone confronted you, you found a way to rewrite reality and become the wounded party. But today the game is over. Tanya is about to be my wife, and you have just declared war on the woman I love. The silence that followed his words felt completely enormous, suffocating the entire pavilion. Around them, prominent relatives and high society friends stopped talking, turning their heads in absolute shock as they witnessed the powerful matriarch of the Jabari family being stripped of her mask in broad daylight. Realizing she was losing control of the narrative, Diane launched into her final desperate defense, weeping openly as she hissed, "You would throw away your own mother for her? After everything I've done for you?" Lennox looked at her quietly, his expression completely cold, delivering a decision that would send devastating shockwaves through both families. "No," he replied with a calmness that was more brutal than anger. "You threw this away yourself. You are not attending the wedding. Get off the estate grounds immediately." Absolute panic and humiliation washed over Diane's face as the color drained from her skin, leaving her looking suddenly old and defeated. "What? You can't serious? People will ask questions. I will be utterly ruined and humiliated," she shrieked, looking around frantically for support from the relatives she had spent weeks manipulating. But no one stepped forward. The sheer gravity of what she had done to a bridal gown, hours before the ceremony, was too monstrous for anyone to defend. Lennox's expression remained completely unchanged, a wall of pure granite. Tanya was humiliated. "Your things will be sent to your house. The car is being called right now," he stated flatly. Within the hour, before the eyes of their entire social circle, the proud, wealthy Diane Jabari was publicly escorted to a waiting vehicle, weeping real tears of rage and defeat as she was exiled from her own son's greatest milestone. Meanwhile, back in the bridal suite, the complete triumph of justice began to bloom from the ashes of disaster. Lennox broke into the room and immediately wrapped Tanya in a fierce, protective embrace, whispering promises of a lifetime of loyalty. While Diane had believed that destroying the dress would cancel the wedding, she had completely underestimated the power of true love and community. The venue coordinator mobilized, calls were frantically made, and within 40 minutes, a nearby bridal boutique rushed over an elegant, beautifully simple sample gown. As the bridesmaids and Tanya's mother worked tirelessly to make the final adjustments, Tanya looked into the mirror, tears of profound gratitude filling her eyes. The custom gown was gone, but the marriage was indestructible. Diane had spent years believing she could control happiness by controlling circumstances, but as the music finally began to play and Tanya prepared to walk down the aisle, she realized the ultimate truth. Bitterness can ruin a fabric, but it can never destroy a future built on unyielding loyalty. The echoes of the wedding music eventually faded, giving way to a new chapter that brought harsh, absolute karma down upon the malicious matriarch. In the months that followed the ceremony, Diane launched one final desperate campaign to rewrite the history of that fateful morning. She relentlessly called distant relatives, wrote long, agonizing emails to prominent family friends, and tearfully insisted that the entire incident had been a tragic accident. She claimed that Lennox had been brainwashed, that he had abandoned his own flesh and blood, and that Tanya was a manipulative outsider who had engineered her public exile. Once again, Diane tried to twist reality to paint herself as the ultimate victim of an ungrateful family. But this time, her brilliant facade completely crumbled. There were witnesses, dozens of them, who had seen the aftermath of her cruelty and watched her public removal from the estate. The wealthy social circle she had spent her entire life trying to impress began to quietly turn their backs on her. The invitations to high society galas stopped arriving, her phone grew entirely silent, and the prominent reputation she valued above all else was permanently stained. She was left utterly isolated in her large, empty mansion, consumed by the very bitterness she had tried to use as a weapon, facing the cold reality of a life completely cut off from her only son and any future grandchildren. For Tanya and Lennox, their life transformed into a beautiful testament to resilience, love, and mutual respect. The trauma of their wedding day did not break them. Instead, it acted as a roaring fire that forged an unbreakable bond between them. Lennox stood 10 toes down as a protective, fiercely loyal husband, proving that true love demands firm boundaries. Tanya's career continued to flourish, and she was embraced with open arms by the rest of the Jabari family, who deeply respected the immense grace and dignity she had shown during the worst crisis of her life. Nearly a year later, Tanya would occasionally still look back at the photographs of her wedding day. She didn't see a ruined dress. She saw a room full of people who had rushed to her defense, a husband who had chosen her over toxic manipulation, and a beautiful future that had survived a malicious storm. She realized a powerful philosophical truth. The strongest marriages are never built during perfect, effortless moments. They are built in the trenches of adversity, when two people decide that protecting their sacred peace matters infinitely more than pleasing those who are determined to destroy it all along. You would believe that a parent's greatest joy is for their child to find the absolute love of their life and live happily ever after. Diane knew how deeply Lennox loved Tanya, but because of a toxic possessive need for control, she chose hatred over acceptance, viewing another woman's love as a threat to her authority. But, as the sacred vows remind us, a man must leave his parents and cling tightly to the partner he has chosen for the rest of his days. Diane was entirely wrong in every single ramification, and justice ultimately triumphed because Lennox possessed the courage to stand by his wife. We see this exact tragedy unfolding in so many marriages around the world today, where a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law, or a partner is silently hated, undermined, and targeted by toxic in-laws for reasons no logical mind can fathom. People still blindly enter these marriages, constantly trying to prove their worth to a family that will never accept them, and it ultimately leads to deep resentment, severe anxiety, depression, and a generational hatred that eventually transfers down to the innocent children. I can tell you for an absolute fact, it is not worth it. It is never worth trading your joy, your mental health, or your human dignity just to marry into a family where your partner will not fiercely stand up for you. If you find yourself in a situation where you are constantly forced to prove your humanity, you are better off walking away, because there is always true love, real respect, and a better life waiting for you out there, with people who will cherish you without conditions. But if your partner is willing to fight alongside you, then you stand firm and you protect your love with everything you have. What are your honest thoughts on Diane's harsh karma and Lennox's ultimate choice? Let me know down in the comment section below. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic life story. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.